The rain fell in soft threads across the city. Althea stood outside the Hamilton Private Wellness Center, coat damp, hands tight around a folded appointment slip. Inside, under the cold chandelier light, a young white receptionist looked up and frowned slightly, as though smelling something sour. "I'm sorry, you must be at the wrong place." "No, I have an appointment." The woman smiled tightly. "This clinic is for VIP clients, private referrals only. I'm afraid—" She didn't finish. She didn't have to. The room behind her, filled with well-dressed white patients, fell quiet. Someone laughed softly. Althea left without a word, but she would return. And next time they'd know exactly who she was. It smelled like money in that room. Old money, not fresh. Not new shoes or perfume off a Macy's counter, but money that had sat for years in safe deposit boxes and oak-paneled trust meetings. The waiting area of Hamilton Private Wellness wasn't just clean. It was curated. Even the silence felt intentional. Althea sat near the window, her coat damp and bunched beneath her. She smoothed it under her, but it didn't help. She could feel the weight of it, like sitting on a wet newspaper. The chair was one of those expensive ones that looked better than it felt. She didn't shift around too much, didn't want to draw attention. Not that it mattered. Eyes had already found her. A woman in beige heels walked past, paused for just a second too long, and turned away with a small shake of the head. A man across from her lowered his copy of the Wall Street Journal and gave her a once-over so quick and practiced it might have passed for polite. But it wasn't polite. It was surveillance. Althea folded her hands in her lap. She'd been in worse places. The DMV on a summer day. The back of the bus with no AC. The grocery store where she once waited 40 minutes for customer service, only to watch a white teenager get helped in 30 seconds. She'd learned to catalog these moments like postcards from a place she didn't want to visit, but never really left. Still, there was something different about this one. "Excuse me," a soft voice said. Althea turned. A woman stood above her, maybe mid-50s, hair blown out in the expensive way, not the DIY kind. Pearl earrings, understated makeup, the kind of woman who wore a tennis bracelet and actually played tennis. "I think this seat's taken. My husband just stepped out to take a call." Althea blinked. "Oh, I didn't see anything on it?" "Well, it was. Could you move?" There were 3 empty seats just behind her, wide open. Althea could have pointed that out, but she didn't. Instead, she stood, moved her coat, and slid over to the next row. Her knees cracked as she sat again, louder than she wanted. The woman gave a polite smile that barely reached her lips, then took her original seat as if reclaiming territory. Althea bit the inside of her cheek. She looked around. The paintings on the walls weren't even paintings, just oversized splashes of color in wide, arrogant frames, the kind of art that meant nothing but cost 5 figures. A sleek diffuser puffed out citrus and cedarwood every few minutes. The scent hung in the air like a warning. This place wasn't for everyone. She glanced toward the reception desk again. The woman who'd dismissed her earlier while typed casually on her keyboard, chatting with another receptionist who had come on shift. Laughter, quick and practiced, passed between them like a secret. No one had asked Althea to sign anything. No clipboard. No "how's your pain" on a scale of 1 to 10 form. Just dismissal. Wrapped in a smile. A young man with a buzz cut and polished boots was called next. He looked down at his phone the whole walk toward the consultation rooms. Didn't say a word. No one questioned if he belonged. Althea shifted again, trying to quiet the voice rising in her throat. She remembered once when she was 9 waiting with her mother outside the house where her mom cleaned every Tuesday. A big white colonial in Easton. They were early, so they sat on the front steps. The homeowner came out. Red hair, redder face, and said, "You can wait around back. I don't want the neighbors thinking anything." Her mother stood slowly, smoothed her skirt, and said nothing. They walked around the back, through gravel and weeds, and waited by the garbage bins. Althea never forgot the way her mother's hands trembled, even as her face stayed calm. Like she'd been trained to break in private. That day, Althea swore something inside her. She would never be quiet in the face of small humiliations. And yet, here she was, sitting on a chair that wasn't really hers, in a clinic that told her, wordlessly, she wasn't welcome. She reached into her coat pocket and unfolded the appointment paper again, smoothing it with her thumb. Her name still printed clearly. The address matched. The doctor's name spelled right. Everything in order. And still, it wasn't enough. A man in a sharp navy suit came in, dripping rain, and the receptionist practically stood up to greet him. "Mr. Daniels, so sorry about the weather. Dr. Levinson is almost ready for you." Althea blinked slowly. That was her doctor. That was her time slot. No one looked her way. Her chest tightened, and not from anger exactly, but from that old familiar burn. The one that came from being looked at and never seen. And for the first time in a long while, Althea wondered, what would happen if she didn't just walk away? "Ma'am, I already told you. There's no one by that name in the system." The receptionist's tone had flattened now, less polite, more mechanical, like she was tired of playing nice. Her manicured fingers hovered above the keyboard, though she hadn't typed anything since Althea first walked in. Althea held out her phone, again. "There's the confirmation, right here. I got the text last night and the reminder email this morning. It has today's date, my name, my appointment time." The woman gave the screen a cursory glance and then looked back at Althea with a smile that didn't bother pretending anymore. "That might be from an old scheduling glitch," she said lightly. "It happens sometimes with third-party apps. It doesn't mean the appointment is valid." Althea's voice caught in her throat. She swallowed. "It's not a glitch. I made the appointment through your official site." "Ma'am," the woman said, softer now but firmer, "you're not on the list. I've checked. You'll need to reschedule somewhere else." Althea stood very still. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She could feel her heart knocking in her chest, not out of fear exactly, but disbelief. Like something sacred had cracked. This wasn't a coffee shop turning her away. This wasn't a restaurant pretending to lose her reservation. This was her health. Someone behind her shifted. A low, irritated sigh. Then a man's voice, sharp and too close. "Can you just let her know she needs to leave? Some of us have actual appointments." She turned slightly, catching his face. Pale, maybe mid-40s, dressed like he lived on golf courses. His jaw clenched when she met his eyes, but he didn't flinch. Althea took a step back. Not toward the door, just away from the desk. Still inside the room, but no longer part of it. The receptionist exhaled. "I'm sorry for the confusion," she said, louder now, eyes flicking to the others. "Sometimes the system sends reminders even if there's no actual slot reserved. It happens more than you'd think." And there it was again, that crowd management tone, that public performance of professionalism. Althea could feel it. The whole room silently shifting, not just in bodies, but in posture, in atmosphere. A silent expectation that she would leave. Quietly. without making it a thing. The man in the golf clothes stepped past her now, brushing her shoulder, and muttered, "Unbelievable," under his breath. It wasn't even the words. It was how casually they dropped from his mouth, like she was gum on a shoe. Althea stood there a moment longer, her arms hanging awkwardly, unsure of where to put her anger. If she raised her voice, she knew exactly what would happen. People would frown, phones might come out, a security guard would be called, a report would be written with words like disruptive and agitated. So instead, she nodded once. "Thank you for your time," she said. Then she turned and walked out. Not fast, not slow, just steady. Outside that the rain had thickened. Her shoes, never waterproof, barely warm, were soaked within 3 steps. Water slipped in through the seams, cold against her skin. She didn't bother to fix her hood. Let the rain come. She kept walking, past the line of polished cars with tinted windows, past the neatly trimmed hedges that lined the building. Her thoughts ran ahead of her, darting in too many directions to follow. By the time she reached the corner, the streetlights were blinking yellow. She crossed and walked another 2 blocks to the train station. A city bench waited under a metal awning, slick with rain but empty. She sat. The cold crept in deeper now, not just in her feet, but in her bones. She rubbed her hands together slowly, like she was trying to remember what warmth felt like. She used to dream of becoming a doctor. Back in high school, she stayed late in the library every night, checking out books about anatomy and reading medical journals like they were fairy tales. At community college, she made it through 2 semesters of nursing classes. She even passed the hardest pharmacology exam on her first try. But tuition went up. Her mother got sick. The loans they offered came with interest rates that felt like a trap. She dropped out. Took a job at a local library branch. Nothing fancy, just shelving books, helping kids log into computers, answering phone calls from the same old ladies every morning, asking if the Reader's Digest had arrived yet. It wasn't what she'd planned, but it was hers. Honest work, a quiet kind of usefulness. Still, she hadn't forgotten the dream, hadn't let it rot. It stayed inside her like a small seed, waiting. And now here she was, turned away from the kind of clinic she once imagined working in. Not for lack of insurance, not for being late, but for something no one said aloud. Something that floated around her like a scent only certain people could smell. She looked down at her hands. No ring, no title, just skin. Brown. Dry around the knuckles, holding a phone that still showed her appointment confirmation, bold and undeniable. It didn't matter. Not today. Not in that place. Not to them. She didn't say anything that night. Not a word about the clinic. Not about the receptionist, the man in the golf pullover, the way her name had vanished like it had never existed. She came home, peeled off her wet socks in the laundry room, and went straight to the kitchen like any other Tuesday. Langston was already at the counter, slicing lemons for tea, his tie still perfectly knotted, even at 8 p.m. That was his way, precise, even in exhaustion. His stethoscope hung by the back door. She watched him from the hallway, the narrow glow of the under-cabinet lights catching on the silver at his temples. "You're late," he said gently, without looking up. "Bus was slow," she replied. It wasn't a lie, just a piece of the whole thing. He paused, just for a moment, and then kept cutting. "You eat yet?" he asked. "Not hungry." Langston turned to her then. Not all the way, just enough to see her face. Something in his eyes flickered. His hands slowed, the knife still in midair. What happened? Nothing, she said, too fast. He didn't press, not right away, but she could feel it, the silence he left open for her to walk into. And when she didn't, he only nodded once and poured her a cup of tea. They sat at the kitchen table like they had every night for the past 10 years. But her hands didn't warm around the mug the way they usually did. She just stared at the steam curling upward, disappearing into the soft, humming dark. Langston didn't ask again, but he knew. The next morning, Althea was still in bed when she heard the garage door open. Langston didn't leave early, not unless something was wrong. She sat up, heart thudding, and watched from the upstairs window as the black sedan pulled out of the driveway, smooth and deliberate. No rush, no hesitation, just purpose. The receptionist at Hamilton Private Wellness Center recognized him before he reached the door. Of course she did. He was Dr. Langston Brooks, the head of internal medicine, the man whose name had opened this clinic's donor wing 3 years earlier, the man whose quiet presence in meetings had weight, the man they'd never seen angry. But that morning, he didn't smile. He walked straight to the front desk. "I need to speak with Dr. Halbridge," he said. The receptionist stood so fast her chair tipped slightly. "Oh, of course, Dr. Brooks. I didn't realize you had a meeting scheduled. Let me just—" "I don't have a meeting," he said, calm as stone. "This isn't a meeting." The room fell quiet. The other receptionist, newer, younger, froze with a clipboard halfway to a patient. A man waiting near the window folded his newspaper in half, slower than necessary, listening without pretending otherwise. Dr. Halbridge arrived 3 minutes later, his smile already tight. "Langston," he said, holding out a hand. "Didn't expect to see you today." "I'm sure you didn't," Langston said. He didn't take the hand. They stepped into an empty consultation room. Langston closed the door behind them. "My wife came here yesterday," he began, voice low. "She had an appointment scheduled, confirmation in hand, email, text. Her name was on your system until it wasn't." Dr. Halbridge's face twitched. He opened his mouth, but Langston held up a hand. She was turned away, publicly, in front of a full waiting room. No effort to verify her. No offer to call me. She was humiliated. There was no rage in his voice, no pitch, but it rang through the room like a bell. Dr. Halbridge cleared his throat. I wasn't informed. If I had known—" "That's the problem, Roger. You weren't informed. Because no one thought a black woman in a thrift store coat could possibly belong here. No one thought she might be married to someone who'd helped build this place." He paused. "No one thought, and that's the issue." Outside the room, the front desk had fallen to a hush. The receptionist who'd spoken to Althea the day before now sat rigid, her screen blank, fingers still. Langston placed both hands on the back of the guest chair across from him. "She didn't want me to know. She didn't come home angry or demanding an apology. She came home ashamed." He let the words settle, their weight filling the space. "Now I'm here, so you can think about what that means, Dr." Halbridge nodded, mouth drawn, eyes flicking toward the door was like he wanted to leave but didn't dare. Langston straightened, buttoned his coat. No handshake, no farewell. And as he walked out, past the same reception desk where she had been dismissed, like an error, like a glitch, he met the receptionist's eyes and said quietly, "You'll want to remember her name next time." Then he left. Not with noise, but with silence sharp enough to leave a mark. The data didn't lie. It never did. Langston sat in the admin office, a space too clean to feel real, staring at the glowing screen while the IT tech scrolled in slow silence. A soft hum of the server filled the room like a second presence. "There," Langston said, pointing. "Althea Brooks, 9:30 a.m. Dr. Levinson. Confirmed, entered into the system 2 weeks ago. Notification sent twice." The tech nodded, uneasy. "Yeah, it's all here. I don't understand how it wasn't visible on the front end." Langston did. He didn't say it, not yet. Dr. Halbridge was standing behind him, arms crossed, mouth a hard line. He looked like a man trying not to look guilty, or worse, inconvenienced. Langston stood slowly, letting the chair legs scrape against the polished floor. She was here. Her name was in the system. Her appointment was valid. "Langston," Halbridge said, clearing his throat. "I'm not denying that something went wrong. I'm just saying, maybe the front desk didn't see the full profile. Maybe it glitched. Or maybe, Langston said, voice quiet but steady. "They looked at her and decided she didn't belong." Halbridge looked away. "You've got a staff trained to smile and nod, but they see a black woman in a coat that isn't designer and make a decision. No need to check the system. No need to ask questions. Just escort her out." "I'm sure it wasn't intentional." "It doesn't have to be intentional to be real," Langston said. "That's the problem with the way this place operates. It thinks politeness is the same as fairness." There was a long silence. Outside the window, the rain had stopped, but the clouds still hung heavy. Langston stepped closer. "She didn't ask for special treatment. She didn't even tell me what happened. That's how ashamed she felt. And she has nothing to be ashamed of." He picked up the printout from the IT desk. The appointment confirmation. Her name in black and white. "She is my wife. But even if she wasn't, she's a patient. She deserved better." Dr. Halbridge pressed his lips together, then finally nodded. "We'll make this right," he said. "No," Langston said. "You'll try." The next morning, Althea stood at the door of the clinic, alone. She hadn't wanted to come back. The idea of returning to that room, to those eyes, she'd sat with it all night, and it still made her stomach twist. But this wasn't about reclaiming an appointment. This was about being seen. Fully. Completely. Without apology. The same receptionist from 2 days ago stood at the desk, shoulders stiff when she looked up. "Mrs. Brooks," she said quickly, almost rehearsed. "We've been expecting you." Althea gave a small nod, said nothing. A different woman walked her in this time. Someone younger, more nervous. No chit-chat. Just short, quiet gestures toward a private room, where someone had placed a small pot of orchids and a bottle of water with a paper straw. She waited there, not touching either. After a few minutes, Dr. Halbridge entered. "Mrs. Brooks," he said, hands clasped in front of him like a preacher at a funeral. "I want to personally apologize for what happened. There is no excuse." She looked at him. "Do you even know what did happen?" she asked. He hesitated. "I know that you weren't treated properly." "No," she said. "I wasn't treated. Period." That stopped him. "I had an appointment. I had proof. But I didn't have the right clothes or the right face, and that's all they needed to decide I didn't belong. Mrs. Brooks, we're addressing this internally." "I don't care about your meetings," she said. "I'm not here for a memo. I just want you to say it." He looked at her, truly looked this time. "You were discriminated against," he said quietly. She nodded once. "Thank you." She stood then, smoothed the front of her coat, walked out of the room and back into the main lobby, where the same people who had turned away from her that now tried not to meet her eyes. She didn't stop, didn't smile, didn't hold on to anger, just moved through the room like she belonged, because she did. And the receptionist, red-faced, hands folded so tightly the knuckles went white, stood as she passed and whispered, "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Brooks." Althea paused for half a breath, not out of cruelty, but because silence, too, had weight. Then she kept walking. There was nothing left to say. Not today. Not anymore. Some doors don't need a key. They need recognition. Althea never told the story in full to many people. Not at first. It wasn't the kind of tale you shared over coffee or between errands. It stuck to the bones too tightly for that. But over time, quietly, carefully, she started to speak. Not to be praised, not to be pitied, but because she knew she wasn't the only one. "I didn't want to make noise," she once said during a community health panel. "But I realized silence doesn't protect you. It just protects the people who benefit from your silence." The auditorium had been small. Just a few rows of folding chairs, a microphone that squealed once before working. Mostly women, mostly older. A few nodded without even meaning to, like the truth had brushed past them too. "It wasn't just about a missed appointment," she told them. "It was about being erased, dismissed. Like my name didn't matter because of the face that carried it." She paused then. Let the words breathe. "Tell me," she said, scanning the room gently. "How many of you have been turned away? Maybe not from a clinic, but from something that should have been safe. A bank, a job, a school, a grocery store line?" Hands didn't go up, not right away. But the silence in the room shifted, thickened, became honest. "This isn't just about me. This story, this kind of story, it happens every day to women who are told they're too angry when they speak up, too sensitive when they don't, to women who carry their dignity like armor, knowing it won't always protect them." She didn't cry, didn't even raise her voice. She just stood there in her plain shoes and navy cardigan and spoke like she was sitting across from you, one-on-one, like she knew you'd understand if you just let yourself remember. "What happened to me in that clinic was quiet, civil, professional, and that's what made it dangerous." She looked around the room then, not to accuse but to invite. "Ask questions. Look again. Listen harder. And then, softer. Don't let silence be your witness." When she finished, no one clapped at first. It wasn't that kind of speech. But one woman stood, then another. And in that moment, Althea wasn't just the woman who'd been turned away. She was the one who'd walked back in and stayed. We'll see you again in our next story, where another quiet moment might hold a powerful lesson. If this one moved you, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next truth waiting to be told.